There's a lot of value in digging in a couple layers into the data if you can. A national number will give you one picture, but then you're going to see very different dynamics in different places. Other opportunities, like monetizing all of these millennials.
Welcome to Truly Passive Income. I'm Neil Henderson.
And I'm Clint Harris. And today we're joined by Mallory Bateman. She's the Director of Demographic Research and State Data Center Coordinator at the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. What a mouthful. Mallory is an expert in understanding population trends and how they shape our world, including the economic forces that impact your investments. We're going to dive into how demographics can provide key insights for passive income strategies, especially in real estate. Mallory, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to this. This is a conversation we have not had before. And I was just saying offline in the green room how demographic is something that Neil and I have learned a lot about over the last few years. We started running feasibility studies and looking at locations of old big box retail buildings that we're converting into storage. And we've learned to have a lot of respect for the area. And a lot of times, if you can see the trends, it will show you where the future value propositions lie. So we'll start off with you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this world. And then we got some key questions that I'm really excited to get into.
Yeah, well, it was fun to get to go to the conference where I met Neil, but because my background, my studies were in urban planning, and then I did a master's in social policy. So there's not like a typical demographer. It's a field that gets people from a lot of different avenues. And so I came into it wanting to be able to tell stories about the numbers of people. And then I work with a great team that's got some sociologists, we've got some statisticians, policy people that all come together to look at the numbers, think about those levers of influence outside of the numbers like births and deaths in the economy. And then we all work together to try to help translate that data into something people can work with.
So, I think demographics is one of those things that people think they know what the definition of, and oftentimes they don't. So for our audience that perhaps thinks that way, can you give us a basic understanding of what demographics are and why they're a crucial science for understanding what's going on in the world?
Yeah, so demographics is just the statistical study of human populations. So, it is a pretty broad field and it can get into everything from, really specific populations in Tanzania and what they're doing, or work that we do at the Gardner Institute that's a broader aggregated, state or county or, how it relates to the nation work. But it's numbers. It's translating kind of those anecdotal stories you hear about people moving in from California for us. I don't know what the biggest one out there is for you, but you all are a fast growing place as well. And so, yeah, just being able to have some data behind what the population is doing and be able to kind of dissect different numbers that way.
My wife is a real estate broker, and it's oftentimes the same story. We live on a little island off of Wilmington called Carolina Beach, and it's the same story. We moved here from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, or California. We sold our house out there that we bought in the 90s. We paid cash for back then. Now we've got $1.5–2 million. This is the cheapest beach property we've ever seen. And there's this massive shift. And I think a lot of people became a lot more mobile through COVID. And I can't wait to hear about that. It's got to be some exciting times in the demography world, I would think.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah. When I think of demographics, I think of it's probably a key component, one of the best ways that we have to tell the future, right? What the trends, the idea is that it's trending up to the today line. And if you can extrapolate that, you try to see where demand is going. So how do large scale demographic shifts like population growth or decline, migration patterns or changes in age distribution, how does that directly influence the demand for different types of real estate?
I mean, who's your audience, right? Like, who are you trying to interact with? Who are you trying to sell your product to? And if you want to know who you're trying to sell your, the product, the service, whatever, you're doing some kind of market assessment, and that's doing demographic research, right? If you have older populations, maybe they're not looking for communities full of splash pads and, I don't know, things that are appealing to little kids. If you have a bunch of families moving into a community, maybe they don't want the really calm walking park with, those bars you can lean on and stretch on and stuff like that. So the age of the population, I think, does make a massive difference. I think in Utah, when we've seen a lot of these movers, I think some of the movers have different demands and expectations of a place than people that have been here for a really long time. And so that can be any number of things. That can be, commercial businesses. I've had conversations with friends who've moved to Utah recently after being in bigger cities with more amenities. And, what they think is normal, we just don't have access to because we're a smaller market. So I think, trying to understand what folks want, you would typically look at, their age, their educational attainment levels, their income levels, like all of those different factors that are going to influence what they can purchase, I guess, in a real estate sense, and what they might be looking for.
For any sci-fi fans out there who've ever read the book Foundation, are you familiar with it?
Mm-mm.
No? All right. So it's a very famous book by Isaac Asimov where there's a concept called psychohistory. It's a made-up science where basically when you have massive populations of humans, you can predict the future. And to me, demographics is the closest thing we have to being able to predict the future because humans in large numbers tend to do the same things. When you've got a population that's 65 and older, they start to do retirement things. They're going to need assisted living. Like you said, they're not necessarily going to want to live in communities that have splash pads. When you've got people who are in their 30s, they're very much getting into household formation age. And so that's where if you have a large population coming through there, then the kinds of things that those people are going to need are probably going to come into demand. Am I surmising that correctly?
Yeah, and I think too, a thing that we've kind of chatted about internally because it's hard to convey, but those expectations of the 65 plus audience in 1990 are also very different than the 65 plus folks now. I know my parents are interacting in a very different way than like my grandma did when she hit that age, right? So there's still changes, but you could probably see some of those bigger shifts. And I think one thing with demographics, fingers crossed, you get to age, right? You're born and then a year goes by and you get older. And so some of these things, you've got a really long runway to know there's this huge group of, little kids right now. So in 20 years, we need to be prepared for those kids to enter the workforce, and that's gonna make an impact on all kinds of things. I think in speaking with our housing analyst, who's one of my buddies in the office, we talk about this tension between the boomers and the millennials, and it's kind of like, come on, everybody. Like, had you looked at the births, look at the births that the boomers had, you were gonna know there are two huge groups of population kind of not fighting over resources like housing, but for lack of a better term, kind of fighting over
Competing.
those resources. Yeah. And so it's like, there are things where if the right people had been talking to each other, maybe we wouldn't be feeling some of those pinch points in the same way we are now if we would have thought about it a little bit more. But then in communities where you do have a bunch of movers coming in, that kind of changes what that dynamic looks like because that's a lot harder to predict. And, you can predict births pretty easily. You can predict deaths pretty easily, unless you have something like COVID and that really throws everything off. But migration can depend on a lot of different factors. It's really, the economy plays a huge role in that. And typically younger adults are the big chunk of movers. And so if there's not jobs for them or things aren't appealing to that population, you might not have that movement in the same way. Or if you're a state that doesn't have, or a place that doesn't have a really diverse economy or a diverse set of industries to attract people, if something goes wrong in one of those, then If the jobs go away, then the people go away because they got to be able to pay their bills. So migration is really hard to predict. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and you can set a set of assumptions that you can feel good about. But that one's a lot more volatile than just that natural increase, natural change.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're going to have that, and that can change a lot faster, right? Laws and taxes can change that very quickly. I'm going to ask a question that may be difficult to answer. It's going to solidify my well-established ignorance on this subject, but I know the buzzwords, right? I know the things like, oh, well, everybody's leaving California and going to Texas. And I know that, oh, well, the young people aren't buying houses, they're renting. And I know that like, oh, well, the younger generation is waiting to have kids, or they're not getting married, or they're not having kids. And we have a future population decline headed our way. I know things like that. I know, oh, COVID happened and we had a dip in population. And then so many people became location independent that they spread all over. And a lot of them moved to the Southeast. And now a lot of them are moving from Florida up because of insurance. And so like the migration I see is something that's like, it's kind of the winds are blowing the sands around and people are moving wherever the winds are blowing. And that's tough. But if we zoom out from 10,000 square feet view, like over the last 50 to 100 years, what are the big trends that we're seeing? Like we knew the baby boomers were there. We knew the millennials were happening, but like, can you give us a little bit of insight as to what the average person like me doesn't know about this, that we can justify some of the trends that we're seeing now? Like you said, if the two sides have been talking to each other, if we had more of the information from that macro view, what are some of the trends that we're seeing over the last 100 years that are unique and maybe shed some light on things that are going to become issues down the road?
So one thing that's unique is the baby boom. The demographic indicators leading up to that time were starting to decline. So median age was going up. So you had an older population. People were having fewer kids because medicine technology was getting better even at that point. So you didn't have to have 10 kids hoping that 5 survived, right? So you had some changing dynamics, and then the baby boom hit and it really redirected what was going on. But then I think that makes a tricky situation for, almost all of us at this point who that's our normal and that's what we think is typical, right? So it was this higher fertility coming out of the baby boom. People were having a lot of kids. The median age actually dropped in the 1950 census. And so it had been going up. The population had been getting older, and then it had a pretty significant drop, which that's like my nerd data point that I just love, because it's like it takes a lot to move a metric like that and move that midpoint over, right? So this huge boom happens, and then it sets up the next 50 to 70 to 100 years, right? So we saw, baby boomers age up, they expand available workforce. So as those little babies turn into adults, then you have this workforce that's really fat and people can hire all these young baby boomers. In the 80s, you had some economic issues in the 80s, which made that tricky. I get to hear those anecdotes from my parents all the time. And then since then, those births have gone down. So we've had fewer kids, and we've seen a really steep decline since 2008. So that's a lot less than 100 years. But Americans are having fewer kids. And so that, workforce pipeline we thought was normal after the baby boomers had their 2 kids, it's not what we're doing anymore. And so that's when we need to think about the role of migration. In the 90s, we saw a pretty big uptick in international migration in the US, and that trickled down to all throughout the US. Utah was impacted by that pretty significantly, changed our growth trajectory. And then, once you have new communities come to your state, people are like, oh, I have a friend there, or there's somewhere safe for me to land. And so then that changes the dynamics of who's living in a place. So the biggest one, I think, that stands out is that decline in fertility, in births. And that really changes what growing population looks like.
The baby boomers are such this massive demographic bubble that has moved through the demographic sphere. I don't know what you'd call it, moved through life. And like you said, in the 80s, there was this huge access to workforce. And, you have to wonder, right now we've had historically low unemployment for years, even through some really tough economic times. And you have to wonder if that's just the fact that there's just the baby boomers, a lot of them have started to retire. And so there's not this huge population of people for employers to pull from. Is that perhaps what we're seeing?
I think that's a factor, for sure. And I think you have some changing dynamics too, more broadly, where, teen workforce would come in and fill a lot of those like service jobs and kind of odd jobs. And that's kind of declined in the past little bit. You still see kids out doing their, high school jobs, but it's changed. Like that trend has changed. And so this is where I wish I had some slides, but these population pyramids where you can see, the babies at the bottom up to the oldest in the population at the top. And if we look at that working age population that's the middle of the chunk, it's still a pronounced group of people because there are still people coming into up to very recently, a pretty steady stream of people wanting to live here and fill jobs. But it's really hard to get to that kind of max capacity that we were hitting in the 80s when boomers made their imprint on what our economy is. And so then it's, what do you do with all of those jobs if you have to kind of rethink how you fill those positions, I guess.
Yeah, completely. To bring it back to real estate, which is the sphere that we live in and the conversations that we have, we hear about the silver tsunami, right? The baby boomer population that's rapidly aging. And you hear about people planning ahead for that. And one big thing is elder care facilities. Things like that is something that people are real big on, like, oh, look at this demographic of the silver tsunami. All these people are going to need a safe place to go. And so we're leaning really heavy into to elder care facilities, specifically targeting non-certificate of need states or whatever. And I totally get that. I think maybe there's concern what those are all going to look like 20 years from now. And, what's going to happen in that space, which I'm sure there's always adjustments that could be made. And then you hear about the transfer of wealth, right? This massive amount of wealth that's been accumulated that's being transferred, or almost innumerable amount of small businesses that are run by baby boomers that are hitting retirement age and they're liquidating and they're selling out. And so I hear of young guys, oh, well, we're going to go buy up all these small service businesses, roofing companies, plumbing companies, electrical companies, and we're going to spin them up and do a roll up. My dad he's now retired. He was a small animal veterinarian, owned his own practice. And what I see from working in his practice is that nobody's going to mind that business as much as the person that owned that business and ran that business and that poured their heart and soul into it. So I have doubts about being able to buy a bunch of those people and hire people in management roles and it running as efficiently as the person that raised his children off of owning that business, right? I don't think that's going to transfer as well as some people think, but everybody's making these projections as people are aging out of the workforce, they need a place to go or they're leaving opportunity behind. What are some of the wild cards, like the demographic wild cards, or maybe the less obvious trends that real estate investors should be looking for, not to take advantage of someone else's situation, but the times are changing, right? And it's going to create opportunity. It's also going to create need. So what are some of the things that you think that we're going to see become potential opportunities? How do I make $10 million is what I'm asking you. Tell me right now.
I knew how to do that. I might have already done it and I'd just be hanging out on my yacht somewhere.
No, but it's, life happens, change happens and needs adjust. And how do we make sure that we're taking care of this population and also, finding opportunity in an ever-changing world?
Yeah. I mean, I do think figuring out how to work with an aging population to me seems like a very solid place to be, because even with the baby boomers, Gen X is a little bit smaller nationally, but if you look state to state, those dynamics can be different. Like in Utah, for example, we didn't really have a dip in Gen X. Baby boom wasn't as big here. And then people just kept having babies. And so we've got like a pretty steady stream of people who, if they stay in the state of Utah, are going to age up. And so that would be one thing where I would also say, like, there's a lot of value in digging in a couple layers into the data if you can. A national number will give you one picture, but then, you're going to see very different dynamics in different places. I think other opportunities, like monetizing all of these millennials that just, the ones that have jobs and have some income, like, I don't know, we're going to start wanting to supplement income if we can at some point, hopefully, fingers crossed. I think an opportunity would be figuring out how to make things a little more accessible, because I know at least in Utah, it's hard for younger adults to get involved in the real estate market, and kind of speaks to what you've been saying with the renters versus owners, right? If that older demographic makes their exit from the population, and then you've got these other folks that haven't been able to buy in, so they don't have all of this equity behind them, how do you navigate dealing with kind of a different audience? Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of an interesting question, because I get so like stuck in the numbers that I don't get to kind of pontificate on different opportunities like this. But when I think about if I were to pivot, it's into it's not even fully like elder care. It's kind of like thinking about people who are a little older than my parents, that it's just like, you want a community, you probably don't need services at this point. Like, knock on wood, we're healthier than we have been, and so people are living longer. And so maybe there's some more like graduated community type setups where you could, and then those could be transferred to maybe younger, older people. So
My in-laws just recently moved into a 55 and up community, and my father-in-law was doing decathlons until 2 years ago, and he's in his 70s. So they're significantly more active than what I traditionally thought of as a child, thinking of what someone in their 70s was. They're running, they're walking, they're paddling, they're biking, they're doing all the things. So those 55 and up communities are something where they've really thrived. They moved into an older facility for like a month, and we're like, nope, we're way too active and young to be here. We got to get out of here. And so we saw that there, but there's kind of another side to the coin that I'm interested in pursuing for the younger generation. The last number I heard was something, we're like 9 million homes behind where we need to be in terms of supply and demand, in terms of available housing. And so you have a significant portion of the younger population that can't buy a house, number one, because of interest rates, and number two, because of prices. One of the reasons the prices is so high is because the demand is high and the supply is very low. And a lot of that is when the market crashed in 2008 through 2013, a lot of people stopped building. And so we're way behind where we were supposed to be. It's hard for me to see a vision where we build enough houses to build our way out of that. And so I guess the question comes to mind is like, where are those houses going to come from? And maybe to me, it feels like it's two-part. It's going to be making it easier to build housing, and hopefully more affordable housing, and increasing the number of units, but also more units becoming available by the older population aging out of home ownership and selling those off one at a time. That's probably going to be a long trend. That's a 10 to 15, 20-year play for that to happen. But to me, that's where the equilibrium comes from. We can't just add enough supply. We have to create some as well by transfer of ownership. Is that something that you guys are seeing in the demographics as people age?
this would be where I would normally punt it to my colleague that focuses more on housing. But when he and I are talking about it, like, this is a topic we've tried to figure out how we could produce a report that wouldn't make people mad, that would highlight, like, the potential housing supply, if these people would, go on to the next step of whatever their housing picture looks like. And I think even with housing costs changing the way that they have, here it's been a very acute kind of 5-7 year, just like straight up into the stratosphere price change. And I have a feeling you all probably have seen some similar things with all those Californians and East Coast people. But I think, in the urban planning world, there's like the life cycle of housing where you start in your apartment and then you move to your starter home, and then maybe you move to a bigger home as your family grows. And then as your kids move out, you move into a smaller home, and then maybe you move to like an assisted living facility, or you move in with your adult kids or whatever. And I think because prices have gone so haywire, that makes it difficult for some folks to downsize. Like if that's your asset, you're going to stay in your big, huge house, like because selling that and then you're paying all your money into some teeny little place, that's not what you thought you were going to get. And so I think that life cycle of housing has really also been struck with all these environmental factors that everyone's been dealing with. So I do think we'll see those changes with folks moving to their next living situation. But I think that's probably going to be a little slower unless there's a way that it makes sense. Like you can get some of that money out of your asset that you've been planning on to help feed your retirement. Like if you have to put it all into another condo, that kind of hoses your game plan a little bit. So
Yeah. So it reminds me a little bit, it's almost like what we're talking about is the difference between climate and weather. Like with weather is, we've got the interest rates, and right now they're sort of like a storm that's affecting the way that people are interacting, changing the way that people would normally interact with. You would think we've got this aging population of baby boomers that should be downsizing into different homes now, which would open up a supply of homes for the millennials who are in household formation age. But the interest rates have frozen that. And so now, and on top of that, the Great Recession created a lack of supply of new houses because builders weren't building. And so you have this double whammy of baby boomers who are not moving on to the next stage of their housing life, and millennials who don't have enough houses and can't get into the house because the baby boomers are in the way. And you mentioned this at one point. You sort of said there is a little bit of this competition between the millennials and the baby boomers, both for housing and probably for jobs, because a lot of baby boomers are not retiring as early as they once were. And that you sort of got the millennials going, get out of the way, people.
Gen X stuck in the middle being like, what's going on?
I'm a Gen Xer. We don't care.
Yeah.
Whatever.
It's fun to read the articles about you guys don't get picked on quite as much as we do. And we'll throw into like Gen Z is starting to hit that household formation age too. Those older kids in that group as well. It's an interesting dynamic. And I think kind of thinking of the like weather versus climate, looking at our building permits locally in our fast growing communities, they've really taken a pause in the past year or two with all the changing, market dynamics. We were starting to make some good headway on that gap of, needed housing units. And there's a pretty steep drop off between, 22 and 23. So another little storm that might kind of put a wrinkle in the ideal, this is why sometimes I have issues with like economists, because it's like, well, the model says this. It's like, right, but people don't always do what the model wants you to do. And so, you got to plan for these hiccups and these storms and just try to figure out how to navigate them with what you got, I guess.
Yeah. I'd like to point out that I think both of you have been extremely eloquent and tactful in talking about people moving on into the next stage of their housing situation. Nobody's even said the phrase kick the bucket yet. I'm not afraid to, but it was your idea. I'm just giving you the words that you were searching for.
Shuffle off this mortal
You both
coil.
have done an excellent job. I got a question for you, Mallory. One of the billionaires we mentioned earlier is trying to repopulate the earth on his own. And part of his belief system is that we're potentially headed towards a demographic crisis with a large population drop off. And I'm sure that's happened in the past with maybe things like the bubonic plague or, massive things that were health related or whatever. But like, is there a real risk of us having a massive drop in population if people are not having children? Are we eventually going to get to a point where there is no workforce because 10, 20 years before, people weren't having children the same way that we did before. Maybe it was because those people felt like they couldn't buy a house, or they couldn't hit the level of standard that their parents hit, that they thought that you needed to have security to start a family. Like, is there a real risk here that once things start slipping, I know we've heard about things like that in Japan and places like that, that is that a slippery slope, and is that a real possible risk?
I don't know that I would call it a slippery slope, because the US is a little bit behind places like Japan and South Korea that have seen these really intense declines in their fertility rates. So just a measure that gets used that kind of evens out all the age differences is total fertility rate. So in the US, we're at like 1.67, I believe. And in Japan and South Korea, they're below 1. So you need to have 2.1 to keep, without anyone new coming in, to keep your population constant. So in the work that the Census Bureau does and the UN, they both do these long-term population projections. Both of them, and these were released in like October 2024. So maybe they would have a slightly different set of assumptions now than they did then. Neither of those entities see the population in the US like tanking. It might hit kind of a plateau, but I think, a plateau is something you can work with. And, China has seen some really intense declines, and the UN does predict that their population is going to decline by like half and, go, I think, below 1 billion people out in 70 years or something like that. So it's a ways out. So I don't know. I think if people can have the families that they want to have and feel like they can, financially support them and be safe, I think the issues that are being thrown out there might not be that bad. And I also think, like, it seems a little short-sighted. And maybe I'm not a tech guy, I'm not a startup guy, but I thought the whole point of those spaces was to be innovative. And so it's like you maybe have a challenge being presented to you. How do you innovate and change to adapt to a situation that might be coming? I don't think, trying to force a lever is going to be the most productive way. So like, look at what's the most likely reality and how do you adapt to that, and what changes do you need to make? So I don't know. It's an issue that gets a lot of attention in Utah as well, because we've traditionally had a really high total fertility rate, and it's come down quite a bit, and people are pretty freaked out about it. But our rates were kind of bolstered by people moving into the state with different patterns and different life cycles. And so I think people here are like, oh, we've been number one. It's like, yeah, but we were bolstered by these newcomers to the state that were bringing a new lifestyle. So it's not like the old timers cruising forward. So I don't know. That could be its own podcast for 3.5 hours, but there's a lot of things you can do to support families to let them have the family they want and have a happy workforce.
Yeah, well, and that's such a large part of it. When you look at these declining birth rates, if you ask millennials or the Gen Z, why aren't you having more kids? It's like, because it's expensive and I can barely afford to live as an individual or just a married couple with no kids. And, and you get into these, deep societal issues about, all right, well, how do we, like you said, how do we support those people? Or, that's probably largely what you deal with at the Policy Institute is like, how do we recommend things to local, state, and federal governments on how to handle these changes, correct?
We provide them the data and let them make their own informed decisions.
Informed decisions, yeah. So what, for a layman, and we need to start wrapping this up. We could probably go on for another 2 hours, but I know you've got to get on with your day, and so do we. For a layman wanting to sort of understand maybe what's happening demographically on a large scale, what are some of the data sources that you would recommend that they look at?
Yeah, so The U.S. Census Bureau has a long track record. They've been counting people in the U.S. since 1790. So, they've got a lot of different products that provide those total population numbers, but a lot of socioeconomic insights as well. And they've got a lot of free tools that are easy to mildly okay to use. They have some that are specifically meant for, small businesses or businesses looking to investigate an area. There's one called Census Business Builder. That's a great tool that gives you a big summary of all the stuff you might need. That's our main resource. The states all have a local partner. So the State Data Center is a partnership with the Census Bureau in the states. And so every state has a person that can help you navigate the data too. And that's all on the website. And then this is going to sound like a bit of a cop-out, but anyone else that's got data, it's going to be either based off of the census data in some way, shape, or form, or repackaging it. So there are a lot of great proprietary products. Esri, that has a big mapping platform, they've got a whole bunch of really great stuff that gets really down into small geographies. And there's a lot of tools like that. We don't get a ton of access to those, private proprietary ones just due to cost. But, the Census Bureau is kind of the golden standard for now.
Gotcha. So how might challenges or changes in the collection and availability of federal demographic data impact the ability of investors to make those informed decisions?
I think it could have huge ramifications. You might think Moody's or some other, bond thing or economic source isn't using census data, but they are, because it's not super easy to collect data on 340 million people. And so you do get insights from different consumer spending things. You get, credit card insights or different things, but they kind of need to be based and grounded in something. And so we're really concerned. And that can be me speaking as the state data center chair. I think locally people aren't quite recognizing the potential issues that are going to come up. But there's a lot of stuff like with the hiring practices, right? Like sometimes you need temporary people to go knock on doors and try to follow up if people aren't responding. Like there's a lot of lower hanging fruit that maybe people don't know play a big role in that data collection. And so, yeah, we're a little freaked out. I would say, it's really important. It's a piece of infrastructure, it's important to keeping us running, and that needs to be appropriately staffed and funded.
Okay. That's as deep into politics as we'll get. Well, Mallory, the one question that we always like to ask every guest, is there a book on demographics that you recommend for friends and colleagues again and again?
Not really, because I'm just like in the thick of it with all the stuff the Census Bureau puts out. There's a great book called The American Census by Margo Anderson, if you want a history of how things have changed since 1790. There are a lot of books out there written by economists, and so those can provide some really interesting insights. And sometimes I would say just give them a grain of salt.
I have a favorite book on demographics that I like, and maybe you can give me your expert opinion on it. It's called Upside by Ken Gronbach. Are you familiar with it? Do you have any opinions on it?
No, I don't know that one.
Okay. Yeah, it's one I really like. It's kind of how I got into. It basically talks about the way that large populations moving through their life basically create trends in everything from buying houses to buying Levi's to buying motorcycles. It's very interesting. Highly recommend it. So, well, listen, Mallory Bateman, I've loved this conversation. We'd probably love to have you back periodically, maybe once per year if you're willing, but we've really enjoyed this conversation. If people want to reach out to you and find out more about what you're up to, what would be the best way for them to do that?
All my information is on our website. That's gardner.utah.edu. And if you're super interested in Utah stuff, it's a great resource. So head on over there and you can look me up.
Awesome. Thank you, Mallory. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Appreciate your willingness to share your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening and watching the Truly Passive Income podcast. If you liked the show, if you think it would be useful for someone else, the greatest compliment that you could give us would be to share the episode, leave a comment down below, or leave us an honest review. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to let us know down below. And remember, with truly passive income comes freedom of time, place, and the freedom to pursue your higher purpose.